We're about to dive into one of the most dramatic and dangerous dynasties in English history, the Plantagenets. Yup, this is a story packed with ambition, betrayal, and a desperate, often bloody struggle for power. First up, we're starting with one of England's most hated kings, a ruler so infamous he's still known today as Bad King John. After him, we get his son, Henry III. Now, this guy wore the crown, but, well, holding on to any actual power, that was a whole other story. Then, talk about a complete change of pace. Edward I, a terrifying warrior king they called the Hammer of the Scots. And we're going to finish with the absolutely shocking story of Queen Isabella, the she-wolf of France, who literally invaded her own kingdom to take down her husband. So how should we judge these people? Well, as we go through each story, you get to be the jury. For every ruler, you'll need to decide which of these 5 labels fits them best.
Did they murder their way to the top? Did they betray everyone? Rule as a total tyrant? Or maybe they had other kinds of power we haven't thought of. Or maybe, just maybe, they weren't really that powerful at all. Let's find out.
All right, first on the chopping block is King John. He grabs the throne in 1199. He was the younger brother of the super famous Crusader king, Richard the Lionheart. But oh man, John's legacy was going to be very, very different. So let's look at the evidence. The first charge? Murder. John's own nephew, Arthur of Brittany, had a really strong claim to the throne. After John captured him, poof, Arthur was never seen again. A lot of people were pretty sure John had him killed. Then there's the charge of being a tyrant. John absolutely ruled through fear. He slammed people with crushing taxes and would just take land from anyone who even looked at him funny. John's tyranny got so bad that his own barons, the most powerful nobles in the entire country, actually rebelled against him. This showdown led to one of the most famous documents in all of history, Magna Carta.
Right. In 1215, the barons basically cornered John and forced him to sign it. For the first time ever, a charter said that even the king wasn't above the law. It was a completely revolutionary idea.
So John agrees to Magna Carta, makes this huge, solemn promise. But what does he do next? He goes back on his word almost immediately. He tried to act like it never even happened, which, of course, plunged England straight into a brutal civil war. So much for that promise. So here's the real question. Was John actually powerful? On the one hand, yeah, he was. He was a smart administrator and knew how to run the country's finances. But his cruelty and his constant betrayals totally backfired. He lost control of his own barons, got publicly humiliated into signing Magna Carta, and ended his reign in the middle of a civil war. He basically tried to control everyone and ended up losing control of everything. Okay, time for your first verdict. Looking at all that evidence, which category do you think fits King John best? Murderer? Tyrant? Betrayer? Or was he, in the end, just not powerful? All right, let's move on. When King John died in 1216, his son Henry became King Henry III. The only problem? He was 9 years old.
And a child on the throne is always a weak spot because it's the powerful adults around them who are really calling the shots.
As Henry grew up, his grip on power didn't exactly get stronger. He really annoyed the barons by surrounding himself with his foreign buddies and constantly breaking his promises. He also raised a ton of taxes for expensive wars in France that just failed, and even for a crusade he never actually went on. But he did have another kind of power, a sort of cultural one. He was incredibly religious and spent a fortune rebuilding the magnificent Westminster Abbey. Well, eventually, his failures pushed the barons too far. Led by a noble named Simon de Montfort, they rebelled. Again.
They forced Henry to agree to the Provisions of Oxford, which was a new set of rules that basically gave a council of barons huge control over the government. The king was now king in name only.
And that quote just sums him up perfectly. Henry wore the crown, sure, but for most of his reign, the real power was in the hands of his enemies.
I mean, Simon de Montfort even started calling parliaments, these big meetings to run the country, without even asking the king for permission. That's how weak Henry had become.
So what's your verdict on Henry III? Was he a betrayer, a tyrant because of his taxes, or did rebuilding Westminster Abbey give him a different kind of power? Or does he just belong in the not powerful category? After the weak Henry III came his son, and talk about a complete 180. This was Edward I, who took the throne in 1272.
He was tall, tough, and a battle-hardened warrior. No one was ever going to call him weak.
Edward was a straight-up conqueror. During his absolutely brutal conquest of Wales, the last native Welsh princes were hunted down and killed. That's a pretty clear case for the murdered category. And up in Scotland, the nobles asked him to help pick their next king. He said sure, and then declared himself the overlord of Scotland. The Scots felt totally betrayed. He was a tyrant too, building these massive iron ring castles all over Wales as giant stone warnings to anyone who even thought about defying him.
But here's the twist. Edward wasn't just a brute. He was also a brilliant lawmaker. He passed new laws that brought more order, and he used juries to make the justice system more consistent. And this is a big one. He expanded Parliament. See, he needed money, lots of it, for his constant wars. To get the taxes approved, he needed more people to agree. So he invited knights and merchants to come to Parliament, the very beginning of what we now call the House of Commons.
So this makes judging Edward I a lot more complicated. Here's the question for you. Can a ruler be both a brutal tyrant and a smart lawmaker? Can they have that other type of power at the same time? What do you think? Which categories fit this complex king? Okay, let's get to our final and maybe our most shocking case study yet. This is the story of Edward I's son, Edward II, and his wife, Isabella of France. If you thought this history couldn't get any more dramatic, you were wrong. Edward II was the total opposite of his warrior father. He just wasn't interested in fighting or making laws. He made the powerful nobles furious by giving all this land and power to his personal friends. And then he suffered a massive, humiliating defeat to the Scots at the Battle of Bannockburn. He was losing respect and control fast. And into this huge power vacuum stepped his queen, Isabella. She felt humiliated and ignored by her husband, so she took incredible, unbelievable action. She went to her home country of France and teamed up with Roger Mortimer, an English noble the king had kicked out. Using her royal connections in France, she raised an army. Then, in 1326, she invaded England. Just think about that for a second. The queen is invading her own kingdom to overthrow her husband, the king. It had never happened before. And it worked. Isabella's invasion was a success. Edward II was captured and forced to abdicate, to give up his throne. But her time at the top was really short. She and Mortimer ruled like tyrants, getting greedy and becoming super unpopular. And you know who they angered the most? Her own son, the new, young King Edward III. He turned on them, had Mortimer executed, and stripped his own mother of all her power. She rose fast, and she fell even faster. So how on earth do we judge Isabella? She definitely betrayed her husband. Her new government murdered its enemies. She absolutely ruled as a tyrant.
But she also showed incredible political skill. That's a whole different type of power. And in the end, just like so many others, she was left with no power at all. What do you think? Which categories define her?
Okay, let's bring this all together. We've seen a cruel king, a weak king, a warrior king, and a rebel queen.
It is time for the final verdict.
Looking at this report card, you can just see how messy and complicated power really was. It seems like pretty much all of them fit into multiple categories.
So does that mean the Plantagenets just murdered, betrayed, and tyrannized their way to success? Well, sometimes, yeah. Cruelty was definitely one of the tools in their toolbox.
But, and this is the crucial takeaway, fear and violence alone were not enough. King John's tyranny led straight to rebellion. Isabella's greed led right to her downfall.
The most successful rulers, like Edward I, balanced their ruthlessness with other forms of power, like making laws and showing real leadership. Fear could win you a throne, but it could not always keep it.
So now, it's over to you. Look at all the evidence you've gathered on your own report cards. Who do you think was the most powerful Plantagenet, and who was the weakest? The final judgment is yours.